Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Phil Trulock. I'm Executive Vice President of the Heritage Foundation. I'd like to welcome you here this evening for this very special event marking the 50th anniversary of the founding of the State of Israel. We would like to extend a very special welcome to this evening's speaker, Sir Martin Gilbert, who you'll be introduced to in just a few minutes. Martin Gilbert, as many of you know, in addition to be a fine and gifted historian, is the official biographer of the great Sir Winston Churchill. Churchill described the establishment of a Jewish state as an event in world history to be viewed in the perspective not of a generation or a century, but in the perspective of 1,000, 2,000, or even 3,000 years. Unfortunately, because Churchill's government was defeated in 1945, Great Britain did not immediately recognize the State of Israel. This support was supplied when the United States government announced its de facto recognition of the new nation moments after its establishment. The strategic balance in the Middle East that applied to Britain applied equally to the United States. As for moral purpose, our own President, Harry S. Truman, clearly recognized the historic and political significance of the event. In recognizing the Jewish state and to state his purpose, in addition to rescuing the victims of Nazism, was to redeem the British pledge in the Balfour Declaration of 1917 and help build, in his words, a strong, prosperous, free, and independent democratic state. In doing so, Churchill placed American policy toward the Middle East on much the same grounds as those established by Winston Churchill. Few other nations have been founded on such high ideals, face such great expectations, and overcome such dreadful hardships as the State of Israel. Yet it is today a vibrant, successful, respected member of the community of nations. The concerns of Churchill and Truman had much to do with the world geography and the strategy of the growing Western alliance. But their concern had even more so had to do with the historic and philosophic connection that they saw between the Jewish people and the traditions and principles of Western civilization. They saw the deep and abiding link between the wisdom and truths brought to us by the two cities of Athens and Jerusalem. They also saw the possibility of self-government and the establishment which would encourage peace, prosperity, and liberty for Jews, Arabs, and Christians alike. Today, despite the vast array of foreign policy debates surrounding us, we must remain aware that these higher purposes and this deeper meaning of Israel, in addition to our strategic relationship and deep friendship with Israel, both which must endure, it is this purpose and deeper meaning that brings us to mark this very significant occasion. This event, we're pleased to say, is being co-sponsored by the Claremont Institute based in California. They're responsible for Martin Gilbert's visit here in the United States, and we're very happy to share the podium with them tonight. Now, to get to the meat of the program, let me introduce Dr. Larry Arnn, who is a very good friend, longtime friend of the Heritage Foundation. Dr. Arnn is the president of the Claremont Institution, and in addition to being president of that institution, he is a scholar in his own right, having done his dissertation work on Winston Churchill. You can now begin to see a connection forming. While he was in England, he served as director of research for Martin Gilbert, assisting him in the production of his multi-volume biography of Churchill. Please join me in welcoming a good friend of Heritage's, Dr. Larry Arnn. Larry.
We're here to celebrate three things. The 50th anniversary of the birth of a nation, the publication of an important book. For this author, this is a relatively light book, but you'll see that it's a significant book. and the visit to the United States of the author of that book, one of the greatest living writers of history. I'll return Phil's kind words by congratulating the Heritage Foundation on its 25th birthday. It's a big thing. 25 years ago, this was a few little people, and now look all around us at this building, a stone's throw from the Capitol. At Heritage, they think that's good, a great place to throw stones from. I want to thank my friend Matt Spaulding. He's one of the most able people here at Heritage and the head of the lecture series. He may have been responsible for the idea of this lecture. He and I think so much alike, I can't remember which of us did it. And we also think so much alike that we may be both stealing the credit from some third party, maybe Nazali Topalian at the Claremont Institute. The most famous thing about the man I'm to introduce is that he is the official biographer of Sir Winston Churchill, the greatest of 20th century statesmen, if I may state an opinion on the point. We at the Claremont Institute came to know him first in that capacity, and we think it important to keep alive the memory and the principles of three people we think are the greatest of democratic statesmen, Churchill and Lincoln and George Washington. Those three have something in common, and the something they have in common has something to do with the subject of this lecture tonight. Of modern Israel, Phil referred to it. Winston Churchill once wrote something very like something the great Leo Strauss wrote about Jerusalem and Athens. He said, "No two cities have counted more with mankind than Athens and Jerusalem. Their messages in philosophy, religion, and art have been the main lights of modern faith and culture. Centuries of foreign rule and indescribable endless oppression leave them still living, active communities. Personally, I've always been on the side of both and believed in their invincible power to survive internal strife in the world tides threatening their extinction. Like Churchill, Harry Truman, and every U.S. president since him, has been a supporter of the founding and the sustenance of modern Israel. They have understood, the best of them at least, the connection between our country and Israel to rise above interest to a level of principle that solidifies and defines all commonality of interest. Like the connection in this century between Britain and America, there is something special about it, something that reaches to the root and heart of both countries, something beyond the making of any government or any man. The person I'm introducing is perhaps the best person to speak about modern Israel. He is a great man for several reasons. He is the author now of more than 50 major works of history. These include several historical atlases, a genre of which he is the undisputed master. And I can tell you, if you have children, or if you desire an education for yourself, there is no better way to learn history than to page through those atlases. There's several about American history, English history, Israeli history, Russian history. His books include now a major history of both the First and the Second World Wars. The one about the First World War, which was written second, I have recently finished reading. And you find there, as you find in his most recent first volume of his History of the 20th Century, a man of very great ability reaching the peak of his powers, a real scope and command of detail that is not matched elsewhere. On Churchill, Sir Martin Gilbert has written 6 of the 8 volumes of the official biography, about 10, I forget how many, volumes of documents by and about Churchill that are a priceless treasure to anyone who wants to study Churchill. He's written a wonderful one-volume of life called Churchill, A Life, that is surely the best thing anyone could start reading about this great man, Churchill. Over more than 30 years, this man with care and accuracy has told the story of this important statesman. And if anyone else had been given that job, it cannot be thought it would have gone so well, or a work so reliable and important could have been produced. Sir Martin's newest book is called Modern Israel. It's this book. After this, he'll sign copies outside for anybody who's interested. This book itself has been years in the preparing. He is the author of a major book on the Holocaust, a book on the plight of Jews in the former Soviet Union, a book on Allied policy. It's called Auschwitz and the Allies, toward the death camps and request to bomb the death camps during the Second World War. He's the author of another history of the emergence of Israel called Exile and Return. Years of labor have gone into this work, and people who know his work on Churchill are astonished that he could be an expert on another subject, and yet his command of this subject rivals that of his command of the life of Churchill and of 20th century Europe. I have a personal debt to this man, which was mentioned. It goes much deeper than Phil mentioned. I met my wife in his house, but for him, my children would not exist. Above all that, not above all that, but in addition to that, he is one of the two teachers of my life, and what little I know, I learned much from him, Sir Martin Gilbert.
Well, thank you very much, Larry. All I can say is that I had not expected to see Larry on here, as I have an appointment with him at Los Angeles Airport on Friday evening. So those very kind words were as unexpected as they were flattering and over-flattering. I was asked to address you this evening, and I especially prepared these remarks for you, on the achievements of Israel. And because the number 7 has some significance in Jewish tradition, I've set out 7 points which I thought we could explore. In 50 years, what has the State of Israel achieved? The first achievement, undoubtedly, and most remarkably perhaps of all, and upon which all the others depend, was its ability to preserve its independence in the immediate aftermath of Ben-Gurion's declaring independence in Tel Aviv on the 14th of May 1948. There are very few countries who have declared their independence at the very moment when 5 separate armies were poised to attack them, not to speak of the already fierce fighting taking place within them. Among these 5 armies was the Arab Legion, which was both trained and officered by British officers and had an extremely high record, which Britain had secured, of competence and dash. In the discussions which I describe in my book between Ben-Gurion, the very new Prime Minister of a few hours, and his military advisors, including the previous and future great archaeologist Yigal Yadin, the discussion centered around the realistic or unrealistic nature of battling on at all. And Yadin presented a very careful balance sheet to show that actually the new Jewish state did not have the means to repel or defend itself against these 5 attacking armies. In 1940, Ben-Gurion had been in London. He had been in London during the Blitz, indeed unable to sleep at night because of the bombing. He had gone out and bought a Greek New Testament and translated it into modern Hebrew. And he told Yadin and his other advisors that the same was true of Britain in 1940. On paper, Britain was finished. And John Chalmers, if you like, was right, and the other revisionists. The only way forward was to make peace as quickly as possible. But Churchill took another view, and he took that view based entirely upon what he considered to be the mood and feeling of the British people and the nature of the conflict, that it wasn't only a clash of armies whose strength could be balanced and shown to be unevenly balanced. It was a clash of ideals and a war for national survival. And so this curious link between Churchill in 1940 and Ben-Gurion in 1948 was very real. I devote 3 chapters to this preservation of the state through the War of Independence because I believe it is tremendously important and has many aspects which show how fragile that war was, how dangerous the situation became. At one point, the Egyptian army was in southern Jerusalem, even closer to the center of Jerusalem than Har Homa. Indeed, they stood on Har Homa and advanced even closer to the city from there. The Iraqi army was in the center of the country, and the Syrians attacked in the north. The achievement was not only to survive the attack and drive the attackers back to some sort of ceasefire lines. It was also in the nature of such a struggle that desperate times required desperate measures. And it always puzzles me that it is considered the realm of so-called revisionist historians to point out, if you like, the unpleasant aspects of Israeli behavior in 1948 and 1949, as if they were not part and parcel of the very essence of the struggle and part and parcel of the ideological base which Israel had been created from. The fact that it became necessary to expel Arabs from certain towns, not from all towns by a long chalk, but from certain towns, was part of the struggle to survive at all. And when on one occasion the young Yitzhak Rabin, confronted by an Arab town which stood as a block between Jerusalem and the coast, asked Ben Gurion, "What do I do? There is this vast Arab civilian population. We cannot advance through it without, of course, great slaughter to the Arabs." Ben Gurion replied in 2 words, in Hebrew as in English, "Expel them." And so they were expelled. They weren't massacred, they weren't killed as civilians had been killed in so many occasions in World War II in similar circumstances. They were expelled and they survived. And there were other examples of this ferocity, and they are very difficult in retrospect when we have the calm light of day and when we have this j'accuse element among historians who seek, I suppose, ultimately to undermine the legitimacy of the whole conflict through those aspects of it which were harsh. But as you know from your history, and I know from my history, at desperate times, desperate measures are needed. The second achievement of Israel was surely the way in which it coped with the mass immigration, which began at the very onset of statehood. A country of some 600,000 people absorbed 5 million and did so in waves which were almost overwhelming. And there was another aspect to the absorption which I think we should always bear in mind. The original Zionist ideal was that the Jewish national home would be built up by those who had been trained to build it up. The whole policy of hachshara, of training in your home country, of going to farms in Britain, in Germany, in France, even here in the United States, being taught to be, as it were, a farmer, and then going to the country, and then forming a small village, and then establishing yourself in the land. Not elitism, because farming is hardly an elite occupation, but nevertheless training and motivation. And in 1948, Ben Gurion and his colleagues had to make for them an extremely difficult decision, and one which they didn't hesitate in making, though they had 4 or 5 days of intense debate about it. And that was the decision: do we allow in anybody who wants to come in, even though many who are coming, how true this was in 1948, are broken people, are people who have been through the trauma of the Holocaust, are people who, particularly from the perspective of 1948, could make no contribution to the building up of the society. Now, this was a mistake in many, many cases, but at the time it seemed to be the reality, that these would essentially be what we now call welfare cases, people the whole burden of whose lives would fall as a charge upon the new state. And so Zionism underwent a sea change, and the new state welcomed in anybody who could come. And so first of all, the 100,000 survivors, whom Clement Attlee, the British Prime Minister, and Ernest Bevin, the British Foreign Secretary, and Herbert Morrison, the British Home Secretary, had so cruelly insisted on not allowing into the country that Truman had campaigned for arrived. They arrived as survivors. Many, incidentally, were sent immediately to the battlefield. Many were sent to the battlefield without arms and had to pick up the rifle from the man in front of them when he was killed. And many perished. Many perished without even seeing Jerusalem. Indeed, the battles in which they fell were mostly to open the road to Jerusalem. And this mass emigration continued. It continued in the immediate aftermath of statehood, not with survivors from the Holocaust, but with a far larger number, almost 750,000 of Jews, many of them from the vast crescent of Arab and Muslim lands, from Morocco on the Atlantic to Afghanistan on the Chinese border. And the arrival of this mass of immigrants, also very few of them seeped in Zionist traditions, though many of them seeped in very Jewish traditions, also threw an incredible burden on the young state and on the institutions of statehood, which, although there had been preparation in the Mandate times, although Jewish national institutions had been established in the 20s and grown in the 30s, health, education, welfare, finance, nevertheless, they were new institutions for the state, and on them this burden fell. Mistakes were made, and it again fascinates and actually annoys me intensely that the new historians, I'm sorry they're called new, but they're called the new historians, are stressing, particularly in Israel as we're sitting here, are stressing the failures of the ministers and government and society of those times to really give the new immigrants full status, full citizenship, proper appreciation of their talents. But I think far from calling these failures, if you look even at the photographs of these vast tented camps and then hutted camps of the immigrants, the incredibly meager facilities which were available for them, and the efforts of the state to provide facilities and to bring them, how difficult it was, into the circle of employment and productive employment, and to enable them to make their contribution to the state, it really was an incredible achievement. But today, often the achievements of the past are characterized as failures, and again, somehow undermine a legitimacy. The third of the achievements was the, at first slow and eventually rapid building up of a land which not only was in many aspects barren, but had suffered from the ravages of this war. War leaves no land untouched, and Israel was certainly not an exception to this. Rebuilding of towns and villages, re-establishment of farms and fields, and the whole element which I think so characterizes Israel in its first 50 years, of constantly trying to be at what we would now call the cutting edge of development, experimentation, whether it was agricultural, industrial, and in our time, high-tech. The imperative to establish farms, villages, and towns had always been there in the Zionist perspective. It fascinated me, and I put it in the book, that even when the British were preventing any form of Jewish territorial expansion within the Mandate area, the Jews found ways of doing it. And these ways were often, as on the Day of Atonement on Yom Kippur 1946, during the night of that most holy day of fasting and repentance and prayer, some 19 new settlements were established with the agreement of the Orthodox, because the feeling was we have to put our people around the land. And if we can't do it in the light of day because the British will be watching and stopping it, let's do it at night, and let's choose one night and do it, as it were, immediately and dramatically. And similarly, during the War of Independence, I find that every possible opportunity when a small area of land, perhaps a mile in depth or 2 miles in depth, was gained or conquered or overrun, immediately a settlement was established there, a tiny village, perhaps 40 or 50 people, braving, of course, the difficulties of being essentially in the front line, but understanding that to build and plant and grow was the national imperative. And this creativity, again in such a short time, is very remarkable. We're so, understandably involved from day to day in the pedantry almost of the current situation. It's important, but we do tend in going through these convulsions, really, of every statement by Mrs. Albright, of every statement by Netanyahu, of every handshake by Mr. Arafat, or failure to shake hands, we tend to forget that we're dealing with something which has an enormous depth of creativity. So much has been achieved. And these things represent an effort and an achievement which I think can serve as an example to many people. I followed very closely when one of the problems in Israel was clearly the tremendous poverty of certain towns, a project called Project Renewal, which Yigal Yadin, the archaeologist, promoted when he entered politics in 1977. And this was something which, in terms of global social engineering, was new and was successful. The fourth achievement was referred to in the introduction. And this relates to the democratic nature of the state and to the establishment of the rule of law. It's hard enough to establish democratic institutions anywhere, but to establish them in an area where you are isolated and indeed under constant threat and attack is very difficult indeed. Again, it fascinates me that the new historians have focused on the military administration which the Israeli government imposed on the Israeli Arab areas in 1948 as something which was wrong. And you know how much we live today in the era of apologies. I believe your president is apologizing for wrongs of hundreds of years ago, and my prime minister is also apologizing for historical events and reversing the verdicts of the 19th century. I believe he's going to apologize shortly for the Irish famine, which certainly had nothing to do either with him or, I believe, the British government of the day. And now it is the fashion to apologize for the imposition of military law on the Israeli Arabs. But I've put in the book the discussions. They weren't easy discussions. There were those in the Israeli government who did not want to do it. There were those who felt it was creating a form of second-class citizenry. It was excluding the Arabs from certain, indeed many areas of benefits of the new state. But this was a nation which felt, not imagined, but felt very strongly that its whole security could be endangered overnight, and that loyalty was a factor which had to be assured, or disloyalty had to be protected against. And much more stress is put today on the imposition of military government than on its removal when it was eventually removed. And that, I hope you'll find in my book, is given its proper weight and balance. And as part of the democratic process, and of course throughout this period, the Israeli Arabs were represented in the Israeli parliament, as they are today. The other day I met somebody who questioned me on a British radio program and said, why have the Arabs of Israel never been allowed the vote? Well, I mean, that was a lead question by an interviewer in a rather short soundbite type of program. And I had to explain that they had the vote, they even had political parties, they had members of the parliament, they had very outspoken members of the parliament who used parliamentary immunity to say extraordinary things, and that this was part of the fabric of Israeli democracy. And with it, the rule of law. And I hope you'll have time when you read the book to study the Lavon affair, which caused tremendous turmoil in Israel in the 50s, and seems to me to have derived from Ben-Gurion's determination that no person should be above the law. He had an instinct that once you had favoritisms and protection, then this fabric of the rule of law would disappear. And today in Israel, and it is an achievement, you have a Supreme Court which struggles with tremendous difficulty in areas, new areas of conflict, areas, for example, where the ultra-Orthodox appear to be challenging the rule of law, and yet the Supreme Court understands that there cannot be a divided society in Israel. You cannot say that any one group, whether it's ultra-Orthodox or any other sector, can be excluded or told that its concerns and interests cannot be part and parcel of the general polity of the state. My fifth achievement is one which I think will in due course have a higher prominence in Israel's history. I've tried in my book to give it some prominence, and that is Israel's part in what became known as the Soviet Jewry campaign. Many of you will know, probably even better than I do, the extent to which the first 40 years of the State of Israel were dominated, as were those years for Britain and the United States, by the actions and tyranny of the Soviet Union. It used to be something which was very difficult to talk about. In the recent revelations of the full extent of what went on under Stalin and after Stalin, it now has become perhaps fashionable to stress this. And I must say one of the most pleasing moments, or pleasing things that I ever read, and I wished I could have got a plane and gone to Moscow to participate just as an eyewitness, was when Robert Conquest was invited to Moscow to tell the Russian people exactly the extent of the crimes of their leaders in the past, someone who, of course, had been derided for exaggerating and stirring things up. And Israel played an extraordinary part in this. It had a national interest, which was the immigration of Russian Jews to Israel. And this was strictly curtailed and in some for some periods forbidden, and those who campaigned for it in Russia, Russian Jews, suffered the full rigors of the law, of imprisonment, of Siberian exile. Ben-Gurion had a vision very early on, in 1949, 1950, that this mass of several million Soviet Jews, although they at that time had no voice, they appeared in the streets when Mrs. Meir went as ambassador, but they then disappeared. They had no voice and no rights. Ben-Gurion understood that they were there and that one day it might be possible to extract them. And in fact, it's just one of these historical curiosities that Ben-Gurion set up what is sometimes known in Israel as the Office with No Name, the Lishkat HaKesher, the special bureau that dealt with these things, at first very secretly. Ben-Gurion set up this secret organization to make contact with Soviet Jews in the same month that Winston Churchill came to MIT and prophesied that one day the whole apparatus of Soviet terror would disappear. As he said, a spark coming from God knows where, and then the whole regime of oppression and lies will dissolve. And this Israeli office worked with considerable danger. It made contacts. It found that there was a response to these contacts. And then with the 1967 war, Soviet Jews themselves found their whole psychology dramatically electrified. First, the depression at the thought that Israel was going to be destroyed, which was how the Soviet media presented it, and then relief, and much more than relief, that Israel had survived. And from that moment it became a public campaign inside the Soviet Union and was matched by a public campaign outside. And the Soviet Union found all its institutions under scrutiny through the Soviet Jewry movement. The United States also played a significant part, and I've had a few very dramatic moments in my life, and one of them was to be present at the United Nations Human Rights in Geneva when someone who is here this evening, Marshall Brager, made a most dramatic intercession on behalf of Soviet Jews and on behalf of all those who were incarcerated in Soviet prisons for their desire for freedom. And this Soviet Jewry campaign was not only one which had global implications and had implications with regard to the Soviet Union. There came a time by 1971, 1972, when no single Soviet event took place outside the Soviet Union, no meeting, no gathering, whether it was to do with water or to do with paper cuts or to do with housing development. Nothing took place, but the question, what about the incarcerated Jews, was raised in those forums. And not only raised by Jews and by Jewish activists, but also raised by senior officials of our respective governments, French, Dutch government, and so on. And this campaign succeeded. It succeeded in the general disintegration of the Soviet Union, and it resulted in a further 750,000 in all Jews from Russia, from the former Soviet Union, coming to Israel, most of them in the last decade. And this, like the earlier immigration waves of the 40s and 50s, has put a tremendous strain on the society, but has also given it an incredible injection of educated, professional people, and people who, it was long thought, would be a burden on the society. I mention in the books I was present at certain discussions with Israeli leaders that the maximum 100,000 could be absorbed. More than that, and the country couldn't cope, and the country might even become a little Russia, and so on and so forth. Well, 750,000 is a lot of people, and it does mean that when you buy milk in the supermarket, it has milk in Russian as well as Hebrew written on it. But it has, I think, transformed the society for the good, and it has had the effect, Israel having a proportional representation political system, of having a Russian party, as you know, a small party, but one with great clout and influence. And Natan Sharansky, who had been, if you like, the most known of those imprisoned, is now Minister of Trade and Industry, and a very successful minister. And that too is rather extraordinary, because people said, well, it'll take 1 or 2 or 3 generations before these people can really be part and parcel of the scene. But here is one, and he has other colleagues, who is a minister and an effective minister. 2 other points. My 6th and penultimate point of achievement must be particularly if the first point was Israel's ability to survive in its first war and to exist at all. My 6th point is, I'd call it the defense of the nation, securing the nation. Various numbers of wars are often bruited about. Interviewers tend to get a bit excited and talk about, how can you explain that Israel has 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 wars, and some even think it's been in a state of war since its foundation. And those of you who know it, some of you must know it very well, know that Israel does have a life and a civilian life and a daily life which have nothing to do with war at all. But there have been these moments, fortunately brief moments, when Israel has been severely threatened. And I deal with these in the book, and I think that each of them in its different way was an achievement. 1956 was a particular achievement because the United States turned all its influence against Israel's enterprise, which was in conjunction with my country and with France. But nevertheless, from an Israeli point of view, Israel did establish that freedom of access by water to its ports had to be respected. And not only did it establish this, but it also entrusted the United Nations with maintaining this security. It withdrew from the Sinai, and that trust proved to be, in the end, tragically unfounded. And so in 1967, it faced a second onslaught, and again, although the victory was swift, it was not an easy victory, and it was not a victory without cost. And every war creates its widows and its orphans and its traumas. And then in 1973, a war in which failure of intelligence played a major part, and in which perhaps the high point of Israeli confidence that there would be no more war was shattered. I remember on the banks of the Suez Canal, Moshe Dayan briefing a group of which I was at the edge, and someone asked him in the group, what are you going to do here on the canal if there's a threat of an Egyptian attack? And he said, the moment we see the glint of their guns, we will blow them off the far side of the canal. Well, of course, the blow came in reverse. And it was a serious blow, and it was a serious blow to morale in Israel. And there was a period, it lasted, I deal with it in my book, for about 9 months, when the whole society was traumatized by this failure, although, of course, it did secure victory in the field. And then the problem of the Lebanon, one from which Netanyahu is even now seeking to extract the country, and finally in 1987, the Intifada, and the tremendous burden and moral corruption, in a way, of having to be an occupying power of young people, of 18 and 19-year-old youngsters, having to be not soldiers defending a border, but policemen defending themselves against stone-throwing youth, and often acting in defense in a way which was unacceptable and which the society itself found unacceptable and unnerving. And my final achievement is what is now called the peace process. And I'd like to make just a few points about the peace process, which obviously is with us all in our minds at the moment. First of all, I'd like to say there's nothing new in this peace process. It didn't begin yesterday, and it didn't begin with the present leaders or present secretaries of state or foreign ministers. In 1948, Mrs. Meir went in disguise across the River Jordan to see King Abdullah. And although some superficial accounts say that he was offended by a woman being sent to see him and that the whole thing was absurd, as you'll see from my book, it was a very serious negotiation. In fact, she went twice. And it was an attempt to create some form of neutrality on the Eastern Front, which would have been absolutely, would have changed the whole course of the 1948 war. And then again, in the pre- and post-67 period, many secret initiatives took place. One of them I almost bumped into accidentally because Mrs. Meir and King Hussein met in the building in which my dentist lives, and it happens to be opposite the London Clinic, and the feeling was that if either of them was seen somehow in the street, it would be assumed they were going to the London Clinic to have a check-up on their health. And they met in a doctor's surgery opposite the clinic. And then Moshe Dayan's mission to Morocco, for which I managed to find some interesting new material. And then the public face of the peace process, prepared in advance, as all these things are, but appearing as a bolt from the blue, Sadat's visit to Jerusalem. And then the hated Menachem Begin, the extremist on the right, the man whose victory in 1977 presaged for many the end of a democratic Israel and decent Israel, who put in train the peace process which culminated in the Camp David agreements. And in my book I make a very strong case for the Camp David agreements being the beginning of what we're now at in many different ways. And indeed, the whole concept of Palestinian autonomy finds its origins from the Israeli perspective as initiators in the Camp David agreements. And it is those embraces of Carter and Begin and Sadat and Carter and Begin which effectively ended the state of war, even though the state of war with the other countries around Israel was not ended. And although the peace with Egypt is sometimes called a cold peace, a peace which has not led to tremendous amity between the two countries, it is very much a real peace. And then following Begin and Camp David, an even more bizarre dove with olive branch in his beak, Yitzhak Shamir, even more reviled for his terrorist past and for his inflexibility, who embarked upon the Madrid process. And I remember vividly, as part of the Madrid process, this was a time when Israel did not want the United States or Britain or other foreign countries to be, as it were, around the table. These extraordinary bilateral meetings between Israelis and Palestinians on every aspect of the future of the area, including in environment. Meeting in Tokyo, meeting in Moscow, meeting in London, meeting here in Washington. These things took place, the conversations were real, decisions were made, which have had important repercussions today. And then we move to the Rabin-Peres-Oslo agreement. I was fortunate to be invited to a small gathering in London by Prime Minister John Major, at which Rabin set out what his intentions were. And for those in Israel, of course, he had his opponents and still has his opponents who claim that he was neglecting the security aspect. I can only say that I was tremendously struck by this man's understanding, and he had been a former chief of staff and he'd served in the army since '48, he'd fought on the Jerusalem front. I was tremendously struck by the centrality of security in his understanding of what Oslo was about and what it could become. And the other side of security, and it's part of the peace process and part of the achievement, and I believe in the next 10 years will astonish us all, is the process which was begun at Casablanca in October 1994. I remember the preparatory discussions for that, and I remember the aftermath of that very vividly, when Rabin presented at Casablanca to an essentially Arab and Muslim audience of heads of state and economic ministers and economists, the vision of what could be a Middle Eastern common market, something on a far grander scale, perhaps even than our own European Union. And from this, a great deal has emerged. The peace treaty with Jordan was, of course, part and parcel of that whole process. And I read a lot of criticism of Benjamin Netanyahu, but I was absolutely mesmerized the other day. It didn't get much coverage in my press or in your press here, but I was absolutely amazed the other day to see Netanyahu building on Casablanca, building on this vision by coming to an agreement with the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan that the Jordanians will erect a dam on the river Yarmouk, and they need somewhere, they're desperate for water, as you know, they need somewhere where the waters building up by the Yarmouk can be stored. And Netanyahu has said you can have the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee can become a Jordanian reservoir. And of course the Sea of Galilee is neither claimed by Jordan, it's an entirely Israeli sovereign sea. And Israel will extract the waters not as hitherto from the Sea of Galilee for its national water carrier, but further north on the River Jordan. So Jordan will have the use of, the essential and vital use of the Sea of Galilee as its reservoir. And something like this is so positive, and in the last few weeks, and at the time of Tony Blair's visit to Gaza and Jerusalem, several other important elements of joint enterprises, of joint Palestinian-Israeli enterprises have been advanced. So if the peace process is an achievement, and in parenthesis at the moment is in many difficulties, and one should not minimize these difficulties, nevertheless I believe it is not only an achievement of the past, but will be the achievement of the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Martin. I learned that Sir Martin is very much in demand in this city, and we've got just a few minutes when there's some food and drink outside supplied kindly by the Heritage Foundation, and he will be signing books, and so you can ask questions of him out there. Thank you very much.